Welcome back. This next session is titled Without or Beyond Darwinism. And our first speaker is Jean Gayon, who is a professor at the University of Paris. He's a specialist in the history and philosophy of biology. He's published extensively on evolutionary biology, genetics and biometry, general philosophy of science, and social and ethical problems raised by the life sciences. His books include Darwin's Struggle for Survival.
Thank you very much. The origin of this communication is a challenge that was addressed to me by Philip Sloan. He told me, well, we would like you to look forward instead of looking backward, and we would like to have some prospective comments. Thus, I accepted the challenge, and this is the reason for this quite crazy title, What Future for Darwinism? I will propose some criteria for exploring this question in the domains of both evolutionary biology and the human sciences. Well, do not expect that I will tell you where we will stand 30 years from now. It will be enough to identify a few general tendencies. For the sake of brevity, I will not devote a preamble to explain why I include both evolutionary biology and the human sciences in my inquiry, and why I distinguish the two. Thus, I will first speak of the possible future of Darwinism with respect to evolutionary biology. Then I will move to the human sciences, and only then I will justify my choice of examining this case separately. Let us begin with evolutionary biology. I will here freely use and extend a proposal that Stephen Jay Gould made in 2002 in his Evolutionary Testament, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. In the introduction of this lengthy book, Gould proposes to compare traditional evolutionary biology in the sense of Darwinian evolutionary biology, whether it be Darwinian or the modern synthesis. He proposes to compare this traditional view with the contemporary state of evolutionary biology through a distinction between theoretical extension, theoretical replacement, and theoretical expansion. Let me explain what he meant by this. Well, you have to extract something general from Gould's discourse because, of course, he used these categories in reference to his particular view of evolutionary biology without proposing to make it a very general classification for philosophers of science. Thus, what does mean extension? Extension, well, in a given theoretical domain, means that the same principles are applied to a wider spectrum of phenomena. Replacement, new principles, replace the older ones. And expansion, which is quite a puzzling word, the same principles remain at the heart of the theory, but they are reformulated in a way that gives a different aspect to the entire edifice. Gould proposes two criteria for the expansion of a given theory. One is a tendency to generalize the principles, and the other one is adding new principles. Later on, I will illustrate how Gould applied these two criteria to his own view of the structure of modern evolutionary theory. Well, I will not go here further in the analysis of Gould's book. I will just take this piece of analysis that I've just quoted, and I will try to apply it in a more personal way to to a prospective view of what Darwinism is promised to in evolutionary biology. Darwin gave his theory a famous name, not evolution, but descent with modification through natural selection, or in the last edition he had variation and natural selection. And this suggests that there are two parts in Darwin's theory. This is quite an intricate problem, a difficult problem. One is, of course, well, descent with modification, and the other part is an explanatory theory using the concepts of natural selection and variation. Well, Darwin did not write his 1859 book in line with this distinction. In fact, he made everything to collapse the two perspectives. But he was aware of its importance. For instance, in 1863, he wrote to Asa Gray, "Personally, of course, I care much about natural selection, but that seems to be utterly unimportant compared to the creation or modification." Well, then, let's ask first, what does descent with modification mean, and how far are we from Darwin in that respect today? And then I will move to the other part of the theory, to natural selection, the principle of natural selection. Well, Darwin did not offer a definition of descent with modification. Perhaps it was self-obvious to it. But he tried and express it through a diagram, a famous image that has been commented on millions of times for a century and a half. Thus, let's look at this famous diagram that I will comment quite in depth in this paper. Well, in this diagram, just to recall, well, at the bottom you have the names ABC of related species in a given region of the world. Then they undergo modification, diversification, extinction, and maybe 14,000 or 1,000 later, or very much later. Well, Darwin says it's as many years as you can. Then some of the initial species have given rise to other decent species, which are represented at the upper line. Well, the horizontal lines are supposed to represent time, but in terms of a number of generations. Well, now, how can we interpret this diagram? Well, there is a first interpretation which has been extremely popular among evolutionary biologists after Darwin. The first interpretation is that this diagram is an idealized representation of what was called after Darwin the general fact of evolution. That is, what big classes of phenomena that just required to be gathered in a single representation. But at that level, no attempt to explain. Well, if we take Darwin's diagram as such a representation of what evolution looks like, then we will see that this diagram tends to represent the idea of modification of species, of the gradualness of modification, because the lines are oblique, extinction and splitting, indefinite divergence, etc., etc. Well, of course, we may imagine other ways of representing the same diagram but with a slight modification. For instance, suppose that we take off the postulate of gradualness of modification, then you will get something like Gould's and Eldredge's representation of punctuated equilibria. The topology of the diagram is the same, but the pattern of genealogical relationship will look the same. Okay. Now, Darwin did not choose to comment his diagram in those terms, in the terms of what we would call today a pattern, that is a way of representing data independently of any explanatory hypothesis. In fact, he did exactly the reverse. He spoke of his diagram. It takes 25 pages in The Origin of Species, 12 in chapter 4, and the rest of it in the chapter of on classification, chapter 13. Thus, he spoke of his diagram as an idealized way of representing what should happen in evolution if his explanatory hypotheses were right. Thus, let us look at this. In fact, well, Darwinists make a number of big claims. Well, 4 or 5, I would just sum up them. Well, the first claim is that the more successful species should produce a bigger number of different varieties occupying different places in nature. And this is represented on the diagram through small clusters of dotted lines that you have in all parts of this diagram. This is very much about processes, not what we would call a pattern today. Well, second idea that Darwin develops, I just take them as they come, is that the most divergent variations should be preserved because they allow the species to maximize the number of places occupied in nature. The third postulate is, the third idea is that the more improved branches will destroy the less improved ones. And this is, I've represented here by just circling the many branches that just disappear. A fourth idea that is developed by Darwin is that the same principles apply to all levels. That is, you can begin with A, B, C as species, but also as genera or as families, and thus, the diagram can apply at all taxonomic levels. And another idea is that very few groups will indeed succeed. The groups that will be most successful are the groups who make more subgroups. Well, you see the exception of the middle one, but in fact, over all the groups that you have down the diagram, only 3 will survive, and 2 of them will lead to many species. And finally, Darwin raises a question about the species that do not change, at least from a morphological point of view, but that persist. And he says, this raises a terrible difficulty for the taxonomists because, for instance, take the species F that doesn't change. Well, after many generations, you will find that in terms of characters, it will be very close to some descendants of the species A. Thus, in other terms, there is no coincidence between the genealogical story and the adaptive story. Well, what I wanted to show here through this rather long presentation of Darwin's tree is that Darwin's comments over his diagram were saturated with hypotheses about processes, variation, natural selection, differential extinction, and other things like that. Now, I would like to contrast this to some challenges that are now addressed in evolutionary theory to this diagram. Well, the main challenge comes from 2 kinds of phenomena. One is horizontal transfer, mainly genes, but it may be also membranes or other things. And the other is symbiosis. Here is the front page. I begin with horizontal gene transfer. Here is the front page of a fascicule of the Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society of last summer. And what is probably the best possible review that you can find over the question of the tree of life. And in this front page, you have an image which is absolutely impressive, saying, this is the evolution of prokaryotes. In prokaryotes, lateral gene transfer is a phenomenon that has a very big extent. And this means that, well, you cannot represent the genealogical relationship between species or taxonomic groups only in terms of vertical relation, but the genealogy should also be represented in terms of genes moving from species to sometimes to species, other lineages that have been separated from them from sometimes, well, several 100 million years. That this, this transforms the tree in Darwin's tree in a mixture of a tree and a network. That the question is, well, tree of life or network of life? And in fact, it's neither, because Darwin's tree of life still works in a very decent way for eukaryotes, for instance, where lateral gene transfer exists but does not produce the same amount of effects. There's the present state of affair. Well, what's this? Yes, this is the front page of Trends in Ecology of Evolution, the first rated journal in evolution last year, 2008. It's ironical, but it says, well, look at Darwin's tree of life and look at what we're doing with it now. It's a mixture of tree and wet network. Now, symbiosis. Symbiosis also alters the shape of the shape of the tree, not only its topology, in the sense that, well, symbiosis seems to have been extremely important in the origin of the eukaryotic cell. That is, well, over maybe 1 billion years, several big events of fusion of genomes have produced what you can see here, that is several types of eukaryotic cells with different types of organelles within it. Well, this again is a mixture of tree and network, but at another temporal level. This is a representation by John McInerney, who has written several reviews on this problem, saying, well, where are we in relation with Darwin's tree of life? And what you can see here is that, well, for instance, here, well, you may have a lot of lateral gene transfer, meaning that this branch is in fact as much a network as a tree. And here you have big transversal branches which might well be caused either by lateral gene transfer or symbiosis or other phenomena that I will not comment here. This is an ironical representation by Doolittle, a star of this domain, who says, well, what does the general tree of life look like today? And he says, well, you say bacteria, eukaryotes are here, and, well, the tree has many anastamoses. Well, I think this is, well, I will not develop further on this problem, which is extremely complicated from a methodological point of view. But the result of this is quite clear. The result of this is that, well, where are we presently? Well, are we in the same state of mind as Darwin? As Darwin in 1837, when he was doing this nice diagram. Is it a tree? Is it not a tree? Well, I will not comment on the metaphor. And Darwin, well, 3 years later, in a strange manuscript, when he tries to represent the relationship, the genealogical relationship in various groups, and is erasing everything, and he makes several attempts, and in brief, he didn't know. And I would tend to think, well, presently, our state of mind with respect to descent of modification is something like this. Okay. Now to sum up, well, I return to Gould's distinction between extension, replacement, and expansion. I think, well, this is a very good case of theoretical expansion, not a case that Gould took because he wasn't interested only in natural selection. Well, first, Gould's two criteria are satisfied. In fact, what we observe in terms of genealogical relationship between organisms is that, first, we have some sort of generalization of Darwin's descent of modification, in the sense that descent of modification applies not only to lineages of organisms and species, but also, and quite independently, to infra-organismic levels. And this is why you have a tree and a network. And second, you have addition of new principles, in the sense that when modern theory considers other sources of variation that make a dramatic change in the pattern of life, that, for instance, horizontal gene transfer or symbiosis. Well, that's enough for the first case. I come to now to natural selection. I told you that Gould built his distinction, extension, expansion, replacement, in a very simple case. He said, well, my theory is that Darwinism has been generalized in the sense that natural selection does not apply only to individual natural selection, but also to species selection, species drift, clade selection, and clade drift. I would say, well, natural selection and drift. And second, new principles have been added. Morphological constraint, developmental constraint, historical constraints. I would like here to give a rather different view of this expansion. In fact, well, when Darwin formulated this principle of natural selection, he formulated it with very restrictive conditions. Malthusian principle, meaning that the numbers of population are stationary. He applied it to individual organisms only, and in a few cases to tribes. Existence of variation, differential fitness of traits, and heritability of variation. Now, we can observe now in present evolutionary theory two ways of generalizing Darwin's principle of natural selection. You just have to erase some or almost all of these sentences. Not all, but some. Well, the first way of generalizing the principle of natural selection, as we can observe it just now, the first way is to say, as Dick Leontine said in 1870, that natural selection applies to any population of entities endowed with three properties: variation, reproduction, heritability of traits. Note that this amounts to suppressing the Malthusian condition. Natural selection also applies to population whose numbers are not limited, expanding population. And second, this amounts to decoupling natural selection from any particular level of organization. Well, this has been extremely popular in the philosophical literature for a number of years. There is another way of generalizing the principle of natural selection. It's to say that, well, this is very popular among ecologists. It's to say that differential reproduction and heredity are not a necessary condition of natural selection. Differential survival or persistence are enough. And then one thinks of ecosystems or other ecological entities. Well, these are the two ways of generalizing the principle of natural selection that are commonly discussed today. Note that these two ways of generalizing this natural selection are not compatible. You cannot say on the one hand, well, natural selection is just variation plus reproduction plus heritability, and on the other hand say, well, we give up reproduction. That's an heritability. That's not possible. Well, there is a tendency today, thus, among ecologists to say that, well, evolutionary theory should take in account phenomena that occur at very high ecological level, ecosystems and perhaps above. And then, is natural selection enough? Well, I don't resist to quote here a quotation by someone who is quite controversial. It's James Lovelock in a book that he published just this year. Look at what he says, because I take it as an expression of a concern amongst a certain type of evolutionary biologists, those who work with ecologists and geobiologists. Biologists say a living thing is one that reproduces, and the areas of reproduction are corrected by natural selection. Gaia fits the physicist's definition of life, but it fails the biologist's test because it does not reproduce. But something that lives a quarter at the edge of the universe does not need to reproduce, and perhaps Gaia's natural selection takes place internally as organisms and their environment evolve in a tightly coupled union. Well, I take this just as a sign that perhaps we have come to the point when natural selection is not a principle sufficient enough to cope with evolutionary theory at the level of the Earth. I now come to the last part of my talk, which will be much briefer, the human sciences. Well, why should we consider separately the fate of Darwinism in evolutionary biology and the human sciences? I will try to explain this briefly. Well, in fact, there are two dissymmetries. The first dissymmetry is that if you take evolutionary biology, well, Darwinism has been, under the form of the modern synthesis, a dominant paradigm for 60 or 70 years. Thus, the problem is, are we still Darwinian? Thus, Darwinism is in the position of a fortress that defends itself against many criticisms. But whereas the case of the human sciences is totally different. In the human sciences, we observe a proliferation of Darwinian models in many areas: psychology, linguistics, sociology, cultural physical and cultural anthropology, economics, philosophy, epistemology, ethics, and so on. Thus, well, here it's the human sciences that are the stronghold to be defended against Darwinism, because thus, in the case of evolutionary biology, Darwinism is a defensive position. In the case of the human sciences, it's an offensive position. Then there is another dissymmetry, which relates to what the human sciences are as disciplines and what evolutionary biology is as a discipline. I think, well, today, evolutionary biology is a very well-constituted discipline in the terms of intellectual framework, well, with controversies, of course, and also in terms of institutions, journals, teaching, etc., etc. Evolutionary biologists understand each other, they can discuss. This is not the case of the human sciences. We should not forget that the term human sciences was created at the end of the 19th century, when the project of a unified science of man, or of humans if you prefer, collapsed. The project of anthropology as a unique science articulating all aspects of the human sphere. Well, this project collapsed, and then the specialists of the humans decided that they had better been tolerant, pluralistic, and accept they have different methods, different objects, different theories, different institutions, and different values. And for this reason, I think this is extremely important for understanding what are the stakes of Darwinism in the human sciences today. In fact, well, the plural in the ethos of the human sciences is so important that we should consider, well, the stakes of the Darwinization of the human sciences in two ways. If we consider it from the point of view of evolution, then we could say, well, it's just in Gould's term, it's just an extension of Darwinism. We don't remake Darwinian theory, but we apply standard concepts and methods to a variety of domains in the human sciences. But from the point of view of the traditional human sciences, it means threat of dissolution of their pluralistic ethos. But it also positively means a possible common language for the human sciences. Human sciences do not have a common language. It's more than a century that they have lost this. And while evolution provides one, it may be sometimes excessive, it may be caricatural, but it provides for almost all of them a common language, at least for a certain array of problems. Therefore, we can take the Darwinization of the human sciences as one tool, among others, for rehabilitating the old idea of anthropology. I don't say that this is a unique tool. Perhaps the cognitive science are also willing to provide such a tool. Thus the conclusion of this part of my paper is that, well, from the point of view of the human sciences, Darwinism is both a threat, but also the hope of rehabilitating and restoring something like a unified science of the humans. Now, I've been asked to make some perspective. The conclusion or the conclusions of my paper will be extremely naive. I just obey Philip Sloan. You want predictions? You will have 4 predictions. It will not be very original, but I will try. Well, first prediction. My first prediction is that what concerns evolutionary biology. I claim that the most basic Darwinian principle, that is whether the variation is important, natural selection is important, and if we could add something from the modern synthesis, for instance, random drift, either genetic or other, is very important. But I predict that the most basic Darwinian principles will remain as a definitive part of evolutionary theory, but perhaps in a very abstract form. They will remain as what Pierre Duhem, the French philosopher and historian of science, and also a well-known physicist, said when he said, well, in any scientific field, especially physics, you always have a positive layer of the theory, and you have a metaphysic layer. Thus, I claim that these basic, simple Darwinian principles will remain perhaps not as all-encompassing principle for everything, but as as a hard part of the tools used by evolutionary biologists. I also claim my second prediction is that this persistence of the basic Darwinian principle will rely on massive generalization of these principles, meaning that they are just losing a lot of their impact in the sense that they're becoming very much abstract. And this will entail, and we observe it today, a proliferation of many particular models able to compensate their quasi-emptiness and abstraction. Well, when you apply natural selection, for instance, to the differential extinction of ecosystems, is it still natural selection or not? Is it compatible with Leontine's view? No, it's not. But in a sense, we have reached such a level of abstraction in thinking about variation, natural selection, and drift that, perhaps we may admit such a shift. Third prediction. And now I move to the human sciences. Darwinism will stimulate important convergences and hybridizations within the human sciences, and they will contribute to the restoration of anthropology in the old sense of the word. And fourth conclusion, which goes a little further my talk, and here I couldn't say that I sympathized with everything that Simon Conway Morris said yesterday, but on this point precisely, yes. I claim that universal Darwinism as an all-encompassing philosophy of nature will die one day or another, just as the mechanical philosophy died after 2 centuries of existence. And here we should not confuse between the positivistic part of evolution of Darwinism, which I think will remain, and this philosophy of nature, which becomes so much abstract, so much all-encompassing, that we may rightly think that it has reached the point of its emptiness. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you. We have time for a couple of questions before going on to the next speaker. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, John. John Wilkins. John Wilkins from Sydney. I very much appreciate and enjoy your framework in how you've taken Gould's ideas and talking about it. But I want to just say one thing in defense of the Tree of Life. I have a feeling that the comments that Reagan and his colleagues have made about the Tree of Life being destroyed by lateral transfer are somewhat overblown, because they tend to confuse taxonomic trees with gene trees. And anyone who knows how gene trees are constructed knows that even within tree-like taxonomy, gene trees do not map neatly onto taxonomic trees. So I suspect that what's going on here is something of a confusion of levels in taking the occasional introgression of genes from one lineage to another, you don't actually undercut the notion of Darwin's notion of taxonomic tree. It is true that with endosymbiotic capture, the whole notion of Margulis's comments about organelles and what have you, that certainly does undercut the tree, but these are very rare events. What you end up with substantially remains, even for bacteria, archaebacteria, and eukaryotes, remains a tree structure at most levels of analysis. So I would tend to say that people these days are overselling the web of life.
Well, thank you very much, John. I totally agree, but it's indeed a very complicated question as well. If you take Darwin's tree as hierarchical classification, that is, classes nested one into classes of organisms and possibly species nested one within each other, then, well, so far that we accept that 2 billion years ago there were already organisms, for instance, that reproduced, then we still have to make the evolutionary systematics of these groups. Okay. But what I insisted upon is what Darwin gave us was just not a way of thinking about classification. It was also a way of thinking about the processes that make evolution. And this is why I insisted so much on this. And from the point of view of processes, of course, well, genes may matter perhaps as much as organisms and species and populations. And then we get the idea that the tree of life encapsulates only a portion of the history of life. I did not intend it to mean more than that.
Chris Helfa, University of Chicago. The use of Darwinism in the human sciences has always appeared to me to be a bit selective in a way that hasn't been very helpful. I was wondering if you might comment on what a possible successful future of the human sciences that incorporate Darwinism might look like.
Okay, well, I understand your reluctance. Think of the extent of the extension of Darwinism over the human sciences. Of course, while you may think of, I say dirty subjects, not very clear subjects, such as epistemology, evolutionary epistemology, evolutionary ethics, well, that's philosophy, origins of religion, and things like that. But things of economic theory. Then we observe a tremendous, not only interaction, but fusion of evolutionary theory, population genetics, and evolutionary and economic theory. And then, the whole framework of economics today is remolded around the theory of evolutionary games. It's not only a problem for cultural evolution. It's those people interested in cultural evolution. It's the very framework of the science of economics. Thus, I'm not sure that we will get rid of it before a very long time. I could give examples, but I think that the example of economic theory is really spectacular. It has been neglected by philosophers and historians, and it's only now that it comes to light.
All right, let's have one more question.
I'm interrupting the question, and I apologize for that. I'm going to make a comment. Jean, the answer to the question raised has been elaborated by Ed Wilson in his book Consilience.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Ed Wilson,
yeah,
in his book Consilience, has elaborated the answer to the question that was raised.
Oh, that may be a good answer. Thank you.
Scott Lidgard, Field Museum. Jean, about 20 plus years ago, Niles Eldredge made a large point of separating two hierarchies of life, and you've addressed both of them, and I do think that they should be separated. One he called a biological hierarchy, and there are many biological hierarchies, and that's the one that Darwin addressed, and that's the one in which the infra-individual units exist. Those are linked by genealogy, by relationship through descent. They require reproduction. The second one is what he called an economic hierarchy, and that's where discussions that occur today about the evolution of communities or biomes or entity relationships exist and are part of the discussion of evolution, but more difficult to reconcile with original Darwinian evolution. I think the first one is likely to persist in much the way that Darwin talked about. But there are discussions that John Wilkins alluded to in evolutionary biology to deal with the problem of lateral gene transfer and also the problem of endosymbiosis. And those right now are moving toward a network biology or a holistic biology that asks us to consider the network or the whole evolutionary system as a unit. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, thank you for your comment, because I'm very sympathetic with Eldredge's or Salty's proposal of, say, 25 years ago, 2025, when they proposed to separate two hierarchies, the genealogical and the ecological. And this is the way I was bred into, in evolutionary biology, thus I tend to think that this was a sound view of the question. But we observe that evolutionary theory does not go in that direction today. Well, at least for a number of scientists. A number of them, especially those interested in geobiology or ecology, say, well, we should seriously consider the expansion of, in terms of content, in terms of scope of the principle of natural selection, but with reduction of its conceptual content, just giving up reproduction. I'm rather skeptical about this. Well, Leontine is extremely skeptical too about this. But what we should not forget, to come back to the tree, is that, well, in a sense, Darwin's genius and Darwin's limit was that he succeeded to represent so many things in his trees. It took, well, I could have given a talk on this, on the multiple modifications of Darwin's tree in the course of 30 years. And, well, what he wanted was to represent, of course, well, the embedded classification of taxon. He wanted to represent geography, ecology, and the processes that account for change. He succeeded to do it, but what we see is that, in a sense, this idea of representing everything in evolution through a simple diagram has just collapsed. We cannot do it no longer. We need, and what can we do? Shall we be able to invent some sort of pictorial representation of evolution as a whole, as efficient as Darwin's? My answer is we are not able to do this now, and perhaps never, because it's getting too complicated. Thank you. What's this?
That looks like a...
Should I leave? Oh, okay.